pleased to have outstanding presenters this morning who will be speaking to us on topics very timely to our chambers in 2021. Some housekeeping, please mute your mics. We will have time for some Q&A, and if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat to me or to Liz, and we can get those questions read after the speakers finish their particular section. Lastly, if we get Zoom bombed, we will cut out immediately and we'll have to reschedule. Hopefully it won't happen. Now it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce today's speakers. Brad Cook is attorney and shareholder at Shaheen Finney. He is the head of the firm's estate planning and probate, government relations, and not-for-profit charitable and religious institutions practice groups. He's a past president of the firm and has practiced with Shaheen Finney since 1973, and he's known statewide as a nonprofit expert. Jim Roach, president of the Business and Industry Association. I can't talk, it's a Monday. He's led the BIA as its president since 2005. BIA is New Hampshire's statewide chamber of commerce and leading business advocacy group. Its members employ 93,000 people throughout the state and contribute $4.5 billion annually in payroll to the state's economy. Dave Juvet, senior vice president of public policy for the BIA, joined the BIA staff in 2000. He's responsible for implementing and guiding the BIA's legislative and public policy agenda. His areas of focus are business taxation, state budget, workforce development and housing, infrastructure, unemployment, insurance, education, and healthcare. And finally, David Creer of the BIA. He is the director of public policy. He's a graduate of UNH Law School. He joined the BIA staff in 2019, and his areas of focus are energy, environmental compliance, employment law, state reopening guidelines, safe harbors, insurance, and technology privacy. So we'll go ahead and get started with Brad Cook, who's going to be talking about nonprofits.
Good morning. Thank you. And I'm the proud former secretary of the BIA and chairman of the Greater Manchester Chamber of Commerce, so I have some familiarity with all of you folks. And I have been at Shaheen Finney for 48 years. Shaheen is that other firm, not ours. So Jim asked me to come on and talk to you in general about lobbying by chambers, in specific about a grant agreement exhibit that you got in connection with CARES Act funding last year that flowed through the state, and how it might affect your lobbying or not lobbying different things. If you're familiar with the grant agreement, Exhibit E, that was distributed with the grants that came to you, it prohibited lobbying federal agencies and federal Congress people with any of the money that came through the grant. And apparently some concern was expressed by some chambers that don't do a lot of lobbying, unlike Manchester and Nashua and Concord, which do, I think, some, and the BIA, which certainly does it on behalf of all of us, on how this affected the ability to influence things. And so I thought, Jim asked me, and I thought I'd talk about that first, and then generally about nonprofit categories and how that affects lobbying. The grant agreement was for a particular contract period. All of that money had to be spent by December 31st. So the exhibit and the regulations under the exhibit only affected that period of time, which is done. So in terms of the present, absent some future additional funding under the renewed CARES Act that just passed the Congress, and we don't know if it has more money for this or not, that former one has no effect at all. As I said earlier, it only affected lobbying the federal government or federal agencies, members of Congress, our 2 Congress people, our 2 senators, or any congressional department. So that had no effect if you were to try to influence the New Hampshire legislature on local or state legislation. That's about it on that document. It doesn't apply if you were going to engage in joint or individual lobbying of the state, contacting your local reps or senators, and it doesn't affect you now as to federal legislation because it's done. So people who are concerned about it, and I had heard about it one other place to confirm that information from a local chamber. You don't have to worry about it. If it comes up again, obviously read the document on its face, make sure it's the same, and it would still, when it's federal funds, only affect federal lobbying. If state funds got added to it and they added a state component, you'd have to know that, but they'd have to say it. Jim asked me also to talk, and I hope this has been distributed to all of you, about the categories of nonprofits that you might run into and how that lobbying is affected by them. As you know, I think, probably, as I always say to people, if there's a 501c3 and if there's a 501c6, there must be at least 6 categories under section 501c. You have to be a rocket scientist to figure that out. There are, in fact, 25 sections under 501c that are nonprofit. Nonprofit tax status is given to entities that are formed on a state level. People say to me all the time, I want to form a 501c3. And the answer is no, you're not going to form a 501c3. You're going to form a New Hampshire nonprofit, and you're going to qualify for 501c3 or 4 or 6 treatment, depending on which one's right. They vary from things like charities, which we'll talk about in a minute, which is the most common form, to C6s, which most of you are, the labor unions, the agricultural fairs, and all kinds of other categories. Real estate holding companies that supplement C3s and whatnot. Most chambers, as I said, are C6s. We'll talk about C6s last. But a lot of chambers over the years, and the BIA itself, have had foundations that they've set up to supplement their C6 activities. And why would they do that? They set them up so that people can contribute money and deduct it. So they set up 501c3s. 501c3s, as you know, are the most common type of 501c organizations. They are religious, educational, and charitable, and also scientific and things like that. The difference between a 501c3 and all the other forms is all contributions to a 501c3 are deductible, and therefore the government puts more rules on 501c3s than on any other form of 501c organizations. They can lobby, but they can only lobby if it's not a substantial part of their activity. There are 2 ways they can do it. They can file a form and elect something called a safe harbor, which allows a certain percentage of their activity to be lobbying, or they can just try to prove, if anybody ever asks, that not a substantial part of what they're doing is engaging in lobbying. Any 501c can contact the legislature or the government in any form if its tax status or its purpose is jeopardized. In other words, if you were a 501c, this is the most ridiculous idea I can think of. If you were a 501c3 church and the government had a proposal to eliminate churches' tax deduction, they wouldn't eliminate churches, obviously, but if they tried to take the tax deduction away, you can lobby it all day long because it's threatening your tax status. But to lobby other things, it has to be only a limited amount. 501c4s, which you may have heard of, are the most controversial these days of 501 organizations because they're supposed to be nonprofit social organizations, civic leagues, or organizations for promoting social welfare and education. What's happened is they have migrated into advocacy organizations on all kinds of political activities that masquerade as educational organizations. And during the Trump administration, because a lot of the most conservative ones were under attack, the government basically stopped regulating them because, I guess, I don't know why, but they wanted the organizations to be able to operate. There are many of these in New Hampshire. You may have heard of them. The anti-gambling organizations have a tendency to be 501c4s. They want to educate the public on the evils of gambling and there are all kinds of other ones. They can lobby, but they have to do it in the form of education. Then there's 501c6s, that's you. 501c6s are business associations, business leagues, chambers of commerce, real estate boards, boards of trade, or professional football leagues. One of the great nonprofits in the world, the Professional Football League, that pays its chief executive $27 million a year or whatever. The donations to you are generally non-deductible, but dues are generally deducted as business expenses by your members, so they don't need it to be deductible. The lobbying rules governing 501c6s are similar to 501c4s. You can do an unlimited amount of lobbying as long as it is related to the tax-exempt purpose. And namely, your tax-exempt purpose is to advance business or tourism or whatever in your area. And so you can do an unlimited amount of advocacy on behalf of what you deem to be good for business or what helps tourism industry or whatever else. And what's good for business can cover almost an unlimited number of topics, including taxation, including rules and regulations, including all kinds of stuff. So you're not restricted in any respect on how much lobbying you can do. There is a caveat that if additional money is given to you to lobby, it's not deductible by the people who give it to you. So that's basically the summary of what's going on. To sum up, if you haven't been involved in lobbying, which of course, lobbyists don't call themselves lobbyists. Lobbyists call themselves legislative representatives or vice presidents for policy or all kinds of nice things. You know, the term lobbyist came because, I see David smiling. Lobbying came because these were the people that hung around in the lobby of the legislature or the Congress and buttonholed legislators as they went in. That's how the word came. It's not a dirty word. I wore an orange badge for a long time representing 3 entities at once. I was representing the Roman Catholic Bishop of Manchester, Canopy Lake Park, and American Express. And most of the time I was there was for the Roman Catholic Bishop of Manchester. But when I'd go in to talk to the Legislative Commerce Committee about credit cards, invariably people would come up to me and say, what does the bishop care about credit cards for? And I'd say, well, he doesn't. But there are repeating themes because in New Hampshire, when you're lobbying 424, well, probably 425 people, the governor, 24 senators and 400 reps. Every 2 years, a third of them change. And if each of them comes in with only one good idea, you've got a heck of a lot of legislation to follow, as David and David can tell you. But when it was the credit card stuff for American Express, every 2 years, a bunch of bills would get put in to regulate credit cards. And every 2 years, I'd have to go to the legislature and say, but nobody issues credit cards in New Hampshire. So you can't affect all those other cards that are governed by South Dakota and Utah law. And legislators get really ticked off when you tell them that you can't talk about something because they had the good idea. It's like when you told them about the First Amendment for the bishop, you can't pass a law on that. Churches have First Amendment rights. They don't like it, but that's part of what we do. And legislative representation is not a dirty word in New Hampshire because the legislature has very little staff. And so legislative representatives can educate the legislators on what's going on, but you can't lie to them because if you lie to them once, you'll get a reputation. So you have to tell them you can advocate why facts go in one direction or another, but don't give them phony facts or you'll be on the list of unreliable people, which is why you need pros to do it. So end of editorials. That's the difference. There was a question in the chat box about is there a difference between between lobbying and legislative advocacy? Yes, there's a difference. One's a nicer term. Anybody have any other questions?
More Scrabble points.
Wendy, if I can, there were a month or so ago when the BIA was trying to get chambers to sign on to the legal safe harbor issue. There was some confusion about these different terms. And so thanks for clarifying that, Brad. The difference is they use different letters, but there's no practical difference. A lobbyist is an advocate is a lobbyist. And an organization.
Well, lobbying, yeah, and that raises a good point. Our lobbying law in New Hampshire is very, very intrusive. Literally taken, anybody who goes to the legislature and contacts legislators as part of his or her regular job, even if they're not the lobbyist for public service Eversource, but they're the president of Eversource, if they go to the legislature and they're getting paid when they go, unless all they're doing is appearing in front of a committee, they have to register, pay their $50 and get an orange badge. So all kinds of people get caught in that web when they don't expect to.
How about a sign-on letter?
A sign-on letter, I don't think, if you just collected information from all the chambers saying we also support this legislation, I don't think that's lobbying. I think that's you collecting it. But if the Nashua Chamber were to contact all the Nashua legislators and additionally advocate on behalf of it, whoever did it would have to register as a lobbyist.
Brad, there was another question in the chat, and it was from Dave Juvet. Do you have to register as a lobbyist if you're doing it in a volunteer capacity? You may have just answered that.
No. Or if you're just going to express your opinion for yourself and not for any entity that pays you, you don't. You know, a lot of people hang around the halls of the State House when the COVID's not around. There are halls of the State House, and just express their opinion on all kinds of bills. There are people. I'm chairman of the State Ballot Law Commission, and every time there's a bill on voting, and I go, they're the same cast of interested people who come in and give their 5 cents worth or whatever on the subject, just because they're interested in the subject matter. That's just showing up at a hearing to speak. That's part of your First Amendment right. You've got a right to do that. They can't make you pay $50 to go express your opinion. But if you're getting paid to contact them in anything other than just the hearing, you've got to register.
Brad, I see, forgive me, Wendy, I hope you don't mind, but I see Brian Law on the call, and I think Brian is certainly on the BIA's board of directors, and is also, I think, on the Nashua Chamber board, maybe on the Sauhegan Valley Chamber as well. But my question is, what if you have a member of a chamber that's lobbying voluntarily on behalf of the chamber's position before the legislature? Are they required to register as a lobbyist?
It depends what they're doing. If they're volunteering to do it, but they're doing it because their employer tells them to, they probably have to. No,
if they're, you know, for example, Brian Law, I suspect may at some point, if he hasn't already, you know, go before the legislature on behalf of the Nashua Chamber. So he's volunteering. He's not getting paid by the chamber. Would he have to register as a lobbyist?
No, not if he just went before the legislature.
Okay.
And then what about the distinction? A lot of times when it's not COVID, chamber execs will go up and testify on a particular issue. For example, probably 15 of us went up when the association healthcare plans were a possibility in 2019. Again, we would not have to register for that, correct?
If you only went to the hearing and testified, you would not have to. If you do anything else, you probably have to. If you're the chamber exec, a local chamber, and you do any kind of lobbying, for the $50 and the safety of it, I'd do it. And the orange badge, you know, everybody in the legislature has some kind of a badge of some color, and the legislative term in the statute is Hunter Orange, or lobbying badges, which is a charming term. So you're the most obvious people when you're wearing that badge of all the colors. So they can see a mile away. But it's better to wear one than to have a legislator when you're sitting there, say, why aren't you registered? And then that becomes the issue as opposed to what you're there for.
Jim,
Letters to the governor, state legislators, and the U.S. delegation. If you send it to the congressmen and senators, you're not covered by the state lobbying law, so you don't have to. If you send it to legislators and the governor, you are, and you're doing it as part of your job, you have to register.
Donna, did you have a question?
He just answered it, because a lot of times before we go up to the to testify, we'll send letters to our representatives. So just to, it sounds like it would be a safe move to go ahead and pay the $50, and because yeah, we do a lot of contact. So thank you. That was good clarifying.
Right.
Okay.
You register at the Secretary of State's office or online.
Okay, Valerie Rochon, I think you had a question too.
Thanks, Wendy. So can I just clarify, if we register as a lobbyist, does that then put us at risk of the concerns that we've been worried about, that as C6s, if we register as lobbyists, then we're lobbying? And is it that if we just simply don't have revenue over 15% or expenses over 15%, that we would be, is the 15% the risk tolerance mark? I guess that's what I'm trying to figure out.
C6s have an unlimited ability to lobby. You don't have to worry about lobbying. It's C6. If you were a C3, you'd have to worry about the percentage.
Valerie, I think you're conflating the application for the PPP,
right,
and lobbying, and I think those are two separate issues.
So, but we want to be eligible for PPP, and if we're registered as lobbyists.
But PPP only limited you on federal lobbying, not on state house lobbying.
Well, that was there are a couple of things. So C6s are now eligible for the latest round of stimulus through the PPP. And Valerie, we pretty much, that's all we do is lobby, and we're eligible. So if you're dabbling in public policy advocacy or lobbying at the kind of local or regional chamber level, it's my opinion that you're absolutely eligible to apply for and receive PPP funds. I'm not a lawyer, but I can tell you the BIA is eligible. So if we're eligible, you certainly are.
And you're registered as a lobbying organization, obviously. You're registered lobbyists?
Oh yes, we have 4 registered lobbyists on staff at the state level. We don't register or really lobby at the federal level, with rare exception.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead. You have an extra follow-up?
Robin Munson, did you have a question?
You answered part of it, which is you register with the Secretary of State. What kind of a process is that? Is it like?
Well, when there's no COVID, you walk in. There's a big book on the table. You sign your name. You tell them who you're representing. You tell them what your address is, and you give them a check for $50. It takes about a minute. If there is COVID, which there is, you go online and do it, and they take credit cards. Okay,
so it's
now a lobbyist. That's the easy part. Down the road, there are reports that lobbyists have to file periodically on activities and how much did you spend? How much did you spend on taking legislative? Lobbyists are not allowed to give legislators gifts, and it's the number of questions that come from that are legion. Like, can we invite him for free to our meetings, and can we invite him to our dinner and all that? Yes. And I forget what the number is, but I think it's like $25 or something. And
yeah, can't be anything valued at more than $25. So, but there are even exceptions to that. Like if you, if for example, the BIA does an annual leadership summit, we call it, and we didn't do it this year for obvious reasons, but in past years, we've invited legislators to an overnight at the Mountain View Grand, including the room and the meals and everything else. But because it's educational, that's an exception to the gift ban above $25. Likewise, we invite legislators to our annual dinner, but because it's public, open to the public, is celebratory in nature, that's also an exception to the gift ban. And actually, Brad Cook argued our case before the Legislative Ethics Commission to get them to sign off on that.
So how do you report that?
When you invite legislators, you invite them all. That doesn't mean all 400 of them, but if you're the Nashua Chamber, you invite all the Nashua legislators. If you're the Manchester Chamber, you invite all the Manchester, and probably whatever other towns you're covering in your as a chamber.
Donna, we didn't have to report anything. The legislators do.
Right.
Gotcha. All right. Well, that was all great information. I'm just reading Valerie's that popped up. Is that $25 per event or per year as our last question?
I think it's per thing.
Okay. Sounds great. Well, thank you, Brad, for your words of wisdom. I know I learned a lot. The next section is going to be Dave Juvet and David Creer, and they're going to talk about public policy priorities for 2021 and as they pertain to our business members. All yours, Dave.
Thank you. I'll get started on this and then I'll turn it over to my colleague, David Creer. For the Business and Industry Association, I think our top policy priority is going to be one that many of you are familiar with, which is establishing a legal safe harbor to protect businesses from unwarranted COVID-19 related liability litigation. David Creer is actually taking the lead on that. So that's all I'll say about it at this point, and he'll sort of fill in the details during the portion of his presentation. Every even year, every odd numbered year is a significant one for the legislature, because that's when the legislature builds their new 2-year budget, their biennial budget. And that is not only a long and difficult process, but it's a very important one because the budget is made up of 2 parts: the money that the state raises and the money that the state spends. And in New Hampshire, businesses in the form of business taxes are the most significant revenue source for the state of New Hampshire. So we need to keep a careful eye on what the legislature has planned for business taxes. We know going into this session that the Republican leadership has promised not to raise business taxes. So in one sense, the pressure is a little bit off. They have also promised to make an effort to lower business taxes, both the business profits tax and the business enterprise tax. Those will be standalone bills, but ultimately they will also be included in the budget. And so that's something, certainly a priority that the BIA will be focused on. Speaking of the budget, although we are vigilant on taxes and fees that are included for revenue raising purposes, we also have budget priorities where we think the state should be prioritizing their spending, one of which has been a longstanding priority to make sure that the state is providing adequate Medicaid reimbursements for healthcare providers, generally hospitals. Why do we care about that so much? It's because we know if hospital providers are providing Medicaid services, of which there's an obvious cost associated with that, if they aren't being reimbursed for those costs, they will go elsewhere to make up the revenue that they've lost. It's called cost shifting. And because in New Hampshire and many other states, but especially New Hampshire, employers provide healthcare benefits for their employees, many times that cost shifting will negatively impact the employer and the employee if they're contributing to their healthcare benefit. In other words, their healthcare benefit is more expensive because the hospital is trying to claw back revenue that they weren't paid by the state when they should have been. So that's certainly a budget priority for us. In the past, we've also been very focused on state support for higher education, both the community college system and the university system, because we know that the cost of education in the state has a direct impact on our next generation workforce. And then one other sort of tangential budget area that I know we're going to be focused on this year is the research and development tax credit. This is a very important tax credit for manufacturers throughout the state in many of the areas of the local chambers of commerce. It was established in 2008. BIA led the effort to re-implement that R&D tax credit, and it has grown significantly over the years since 2008. And we're able to track the success of this economic development program. The Department of Revenue Administration that administers the tax credit reports each year the number of companies that take the credit, the amount of employee compensation associated with the credit, how much in overall credits are provided. And we can see incremental growth every year, even during the years of the Great Recession. So we know that this program is successfully doing what it was intended to do, which is to foster research and development and early stage manufacturing in New Hampshire. There is legislation to roll back that program, significantly crippling it. So we will be very focused on that legislation. We also get involved in a number of economic development issues. I think the one that has been, if not the highest priority, certainly a very high priority for the BIA, and I know it's also a priority for many of the local chambers, is workforce housing. Many consider this to be a local control issue. We disagree because the decisions that are made at the local level have an impact statewide. And so BIA, working with other advocates, was a part of passing New Hampshire's original workforce housing law also in 2008. And we've continued to support efforts each year to either promote the development of workforce housing or to look at creative ways to provide more workforce housing. And that includes support for what are called accessory dwelling units, what people of my generation used to refer to as mother-in-law apartments, support for tiny houses, and most recently, vocal support for the establishment of a statewide administrative housing appeals board, a administrative entity that developers can turn to when they think their local workforce housing project has been turned down at the local level when they feel like they complied with everything that they should have had to do for approval of the project. I don't want to take up too much more time, so let me turn it over to my colleague, David Creer, and then we'll both be available to answer questions. David?
Great. Yeah, thank you. For everyone who doesn't know me, David Creer, Director of Public Policy at BIA. So as Dave mentioned, the biggest thing on my list of priorities this year is the safe harbor for businesses against COVID-19 related liability. And so just kind of a brief, although I think most of you are probably familiar with that issue, it might be helpful to have a brief rundown of what that really is. So really it would protect any business that is following state or federal guidelines on operating a business, while minimizing risk of the spread of COVID-19. It would shield those businesses from being sued by, anyone from, any third parties, so any visitors or employees or their families, anyone basically saying that they contracted COVID-19 at that business. We've heard a lot from businesses that, this is a big concern that, if they open up and they face a lawsuit, that's a lot of resources that they would have to put into defending themselves against that lawsuit. Even if that lawsuit is, fruitless or meritless, hard to win on the plaintiff side, that's a lot of resources taken up that could have been better spent elsewhere by that business. Just kind of a quick note about this. This would not protect a business that we would, deem as a bad actor. So any business that is, flagrantly disregarding guidelines and, saying, we don't care. Let's have everyone hug at first thing in the morning when they come in to boost morale. Those businesses are not going to be protected by this legislation. This would just be, the businesses who are, and I should say not just businesses, obviously we're business and industry associations, so that's kind of how we frame it, but any place where the public gathers, churches, schools, municipal buildings, any number of things, they would all be protected as well. So it would only protect those who are doing their best to prevent the spread of COVID-19. Another big thing that I have on my list, it's not really legislative, but it's been a big issue, November, December this year, especially, and it continues on, is the Public Utilities Commission is currently considering the most recent proposal for the next Triennial Energy Efficiency Plan. And this plan really sets out the state's efforts to create programs for anyone, but it substantially goes towards businesses for energy efficiency projects. So, it used to be installing LED light bulbs in every business and things like that. But the programs themselves are getting more expensive just because it's harder to get energy efficiency on these lower the light bulbs. Everyone pretty much has LED light bulbs. So now you have to kind of think a little bit more, okay, what's the next energy efficiency project that we can do? They get expensive and they set pretty ambitious goals this year. And with those ambitious goals comes an increase in what's known as the systems benefits charge. So this is a charge based per kilowatt hour of a business or, on your electricity bill. And they are proposing pretty substantial increases to that, considering some large energy users will see increases in the hundreds of thousands of dollars on their electricity bill every year. Obviously, during a pandemic, when revenues are down and everyone is trying to recover the economy, having increased electricity rates is bad. Bad for business, makes it more of a hostile environment to do business here in New Hampshire. So we have been fighting pretty hard against that, saying that the energy efficiency programs should continue at their 2020 rates through, indefinitely until the pandemic is over. The PUC has, they issued a temporary order continuing the 2020 rates, so that was good. They're going to come out with a final order in the next several weeks as they deliberate on what to do with that. So that's another big priority that we're handling. On top of that, we have some of the usual suspects in energy, for instance, net metering, where they are still trying to increase the cap for the size of a generator that could qualify for net metering. So this is when you have, for instance, a solar array on your roof and you sell electricity back to the utility for a credit on your bill. The problem is the current rate that you're paid for that energy is above what the utility's avoided cost. So it's actually more expensive for the utility to buy it from you. And that cost gets passed on to all ratepayers, creating this cost shift, and that would subsidize these projects. So obviously that would increase the electricity rate in New Hampshire, which is already high, among the highest in the country. So we're fighting that. Any increase in net metering that's above the utility's avoided cost. And I'm sure we'll be fighting that again this year. Also, repeat offenders is Pfas legislation, although slightly differently. So Pfas, as I'm sure most people have heard of, if not all of you, is a pretty hot topic. They passed the maximum contaminant levels in drinking water last year, and but the fight continues on with other legislation. In fact, one big bill this year, I think, is going to be they are trying to hold companies responsible who have either produced or used PFAS chemicals in their manufacturing process responsible for hooking up people with contaminated wells to public water systems, and then also paying for their water bills for 5, 6, 7 years, something like that. So as you can tell, that's probably going to be quite a big cost for these companies to deal with. There's also a bill to raise the minimum wage in New Hampshire. We'll be fighting pretty hard against that to raise the minimum wage in New Hampshire. This one specifically wants to raise it to $22.50 an hour, which would have been great when I was a teenager, less so now for me. What else? Oh, there's also going to be right to work legislation that we will be supporting. So that's coming around again. And as well as a mandatory paid family leave, we will continue to fight against mandatory paid family leave in the state. And those are the major priorities I think that we have in my docket this year. But I'm happy to take any questions if anyone knows of a bill or something they want to talk about.
Does anyone have any questions? Or Dave, do you have some more comments? Dave Juve?
I think I covered pretty much where our priorities are, but I'm certainly happy to respond to questions that anyone might have.
Wendy, I would just clarify, or not clarify, but just provide a little bit more context for a couple of things. Raising the minimum wage isn't a front burner issue for the BIA, but the reason it's on our radar, so we're not going to be standing out in front of the State House with signs saying don't raise the minimum wage, but we typically oppose it because it has upward pressure on the entire wage scale. So I'll bet you there's nobody in any of our memberships, or very few, that pay the minimum wage. Most members, certainly all BI members, pay well above the minimum wage. But the problem is if you raise the minimum wage, then everybody above that new level wants a raise as well. So our position is if you're going to do this, do it at the federal level. So all businesses are impacted the same time, the same way across the country. So just a little context for that. And with regard to net metering, a lot of people think we don't support net metering. We don't have any issue with net metering at all. But as David Creer noted, if the tariff or the rebate or the credit that goes back to the net metering customer for sending excess electricity back to the grid is above the utility's avoided cost, that means, as David said, that the utility's paying more for energy from you than they would pay if they went out and bought it on the wholesale market. And we just think that results in cost shifting. So we have no issue with net metering at all at the utility's avoided cost. Anything above that is a cost shift, and that's why we've been fighting that. So again, just to provide a little more context to some of those issues. And right to work legislation, we're nonpartisan as all of you are, but the landscape at the State House right now is such that that legislation may stand a chance. And I would argue and remind all of us that as much as we would like every business in our local communities, or in the BIA's case, every business across the state to be required to join us, we can't do that. We have to go out and compete and show the value of the work that we do. So if you extend that rationale to the workplace, it's our view that if a labor union wants to demonstrate their value representing workers, then they should be required to do that and not certified to represent everybody if some in the labor pool at a particular business don't want to be represented by the labor union. So again, that's our position on right to work. We think labor unions, like chambers of commerce, ought to be required to earn the support of employees at a specific place of business.
Any questions for Dave or Dave?
Yeah, Wendy, Mike from United Way. I have a couple of questions. Hi. That's okay. So my question is really more about the approach. So specifically some of the issues that, that you just brought up, including the minimum wage, where actually I believe all of the surrounding states in our region have minimum wages. So I appreciate the the observation that it would be nice if the federal government would do this, but we operate in a regional economy. We don't necessarily compete here in New Hampshire with businesses in Mississippi. We compete more with businesses in Massachusetts, Maine, and Vermont, and Connecticut. So I'd like some context for that, if you don't mind. Also on paid family medical leave, what do you suggest is an alternate approach? Do you have an alternate proposal other than simply opposing the mandatory proposals that have been put out there? And lastly, on net metering, what counter proposal do you have that could move the conversation forward?
Dave, let me step in. Mike, I'm just curious, who did you say you're with?
United Way of Greater Nashua. I'm a member of the Nashua, Hudson, and Sohegan Valley Merrimack chambers. Okay.
So I'll start, Dave, and if you want to chime in after. With regard to the minimum wage, as I said, it's not a front burner issue for us. And I suspect that most of the members of your chamber, as well as most businesses across the state, already pay well above the minimum wage. But we're a business group. We're nonpartisan, but we're a business group. So as I said, it's not a front burner issue for us, but we've consistently held that if you're going to raise the minimum wage, do it at the federal level, so all businesses are affected at the same time in the same way. So we're probably just going to have to disagree on that issue. With regard to net metering, our position is that we have no opposition to net metering. We don't care where the energy comes from. We just want to make sure that the credit goes back to you as a homeowner, or the credit that goes to a business that's providing excess electricity back to the grid is compensated fairly, and that others on the grid or that are paying for energy aren't subsidizing, you know, my array on my roof. You know, if I'm putting excess electricity back to my utility, which is Eversource, then I should be paid at what they would otherwise go to the market and pay, not above that. Because otherwise, as I said, it's a cost shift. With regard to mandatory paid family leave, our position is that employers are in the best position to establish compensation and benefits to attract and to keep the kinds of employees that they want. For example, the BIA, we're not forced to, but we have very generous paid family leave policy. And so our position, it's not the government that should be establishing those benefit levels. It's up to the employer. So that's my quick response. Dave or David, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, let me jump in on a couple of things. With the minimum wage, in some ways, I think it's somewhat of a moot point, especially for employers that are in border communities. Because the reality is, if they're going to attract a workforce, they're having to compete with employers in Massachusetts or Vermont or Maine, where there is a higher minimum wage. So they're not going to attract employers in their own communities who can easily cross the border to work for a higher salary, and they're certainly not going to be able to attract employees from those other bordering states if they don't have a compensation scale that competes with the employers from higher minimum wage states. So I think really it is somewhat of a moot point. And in terms of the paid family leave, there was a proposal last year, I think, would have established a paid family leave program for state employees through private sector insurance companies. It would have become a new state employee benefit. But a key feature of that plan was private sector employers, if they chose to, could also buy into that state employee program to allow employers to provide that same paid leave benefit on a private sector insurance program that they otherwise may not have access to.
Great. And if I could just jump in on your final question about the net metering, I think you asked about alternate proposals. There was a bill last year that we supported that would increase the cap on net metering because it set the rate at the utilities avoided costs rather than the current tariff, which is the price of energy plus the default energy price plus the entirety of the transmission costs and a little bit of distribution costs. So really, it was too high. It's above the utilities avoided costs. So the one we supported set that rate at the avoided costs. And I also want to clarify that there really is no limit for arrays like solar arrays. So if you want to build a 4 or 5 megawatt solar array on top of your roof, you can under current law. You just don't get the extra incentive for doing so. That is what they're trying to do. So that's what net metering really is that extra incentive.
Any other questions from anyone or comments? All right, I think we'll move to our final section of this morning's webinar. Jim Roach is going to talk about, sorry, flip my page here, how chambers can best advocate for their members And he's going to give us an explanation and a refresher for some of us that know about this, about the BIA's Capital Connect program.
Thanks, Wendy. So thanks for pulling this together. Really appreciate it. And again, I just want to reiterate, the BIA is itself, as I think all of you are, we're nonpartisan, but we see public policy issues through a particular lens. In our case, and I suspect through the case, which is the case with many of you, through the lens of business. So we have a particular orientation, but we don't care if a legislator or the governor or a policymaker is a Republican or a Democrat or a Libertarian. It doesn't matter to us. It's where do they come down on issues that are important to our members. And so with regard to getting involved in the public policy arena at the chamber level, I would say a couple of things. First of all, most of us were formed decades ago in the case of the BIA in 1913 as merchant associations. We were formed to represent the interests of local businesses. And that has changed over time for a lot of reasons, but the history, the catalyst for many of our chambers was because merchants were concerned about local, state, and in some cases federal laws and regulations that were affecting their operations. Creating a public affairs or government affairs or public policy committee within your chamber, I would argue creates a significant value add for members. As membership-based organizations, obviously we're always concerned about membership retention and membership attraction. And so, some chambers are active in the hospitality realm, promoting their area to visitors, working with local hotels and restaurants, et cetera, attractions. But I think in all cases, having a voice on public policy issues affecting your members is a very attractive feature of a Chamber of Commerce, both for retention and attraction. I ran a Chamber of Commerce in upstate New York based in Utica called the Mohawk Valley Chamber of Commerce. And when I took over many, many years ago, we really lacked any kind of presence on the public policy front. We just were not active. And, I would argue 20 years ago, many businesses, many individuals would join chambers of commerce because it was the right thing to do, sort of support the local community through the chamber. I think those days are largely over. I think we all need to demonstrate value to hang on to and to grow our organizations with new members. And so when I was running this chamber, we created a government affairs committee and we started getting active on local and to a lesser extent on state issues. And our members responded. They appreciated that we were taking positions on issues affecting their operations. And they responded both with very strong retention, but also the chamber grew during that time. And equally important, local elected and state elected and appointed policy leaders paid attention to us. We got their ear. The fact that we were now monitoring and taking positions on issues that affect our members got their attention, and they sort of looked at us with renewed interest and in some regard, renewed respect. So I think there are some very good reasons for a Chamber of Commerce to create a government affairs or public policy committee or whatever you'd like to call it. And I may in my next statement offend some of you, but this is how I feel. I would argue that your government affairs committee should be led by a business person and preferably a for-profit business leader. And I say that because for-profit business leaders see the world through filters that are different from nonprofit business leaders, particularly charitable nonprofits. They view the landscape differently, and this is often reflected in positions that chambers take or refuse to take because of pushback from some folks within the chamber membership. And again, I hearken back to why chambers were formed in the first place. They were formed to represent private sector merchants, representing them at the local, state, and in some cases federal level. So if you're going to form a government affairs committee, I think for both retention and member attraction purposes, I would argue that it should be led by a business person and preferably somebody from the private sector. And I also caution against having government officials, elected or appointed officials, on your government affairs committee, because if the target of your positions, if you do end up taking positions on local zoning issues or economic development projects or at the state level, you don't want the very people that you're targeting your message to in the room helping you establish your position. It doesn't make sense to me. It's like inviting the fox into the hen house to, to watch over the chickens. I just think it's a bad approach to have public officials on a chamber's government affairs committee because they're the target of your message. They ought not to be in the room when you're establishing your message. And if you choose to do this, you can focus on local or state issues. I mentioned a couple of examples at the local level. If your community, if the city or the municipality is, looking at zoning issues or, looking at increasing or changing parking regulations or whatnot, that's going to hurt your members on Main Street. If there's some kind of a local issue like that, that to me is perfectly appropriate for a government affairs committee to review, discuss, take a position. It could be, we're all concerned about the affordability of housing for working men and women, particularly young people. So if there's a new workforce development, housing development coming down the track, and the the municipality or the town or whatnot is pushing back inappropriately, again, that could be an example of something a Chamber of Commerce could review and discuss and take a position in support of or not, or a commercial development, an economic development project. At the state level, the general court has a website that lists all of the bills and all of the language that's being promulgated and introduced during the legislative session, both in the House and the Senate. It lists hearing schedules. We're all reading and listening to the news. And so, through our own work, we're aware of the top issues that are out there that are affecting our members. And so, you can choose to queue these issues up at the local or the regional or the state level. As leaders, as executive directors or presidents of our chambers, it's incumbent upon us to be aware like that and working with our government affairs committee to kind of, queue these things up for discussion at that level. I would imagine that in most cases, the government affairs committee, if it chooses to take a position on an issue, would communicate that to the board of directors looking for its support, because in most cases, I don't think a specific subcommittee or committee of the full board of directors has the authority to go public. So I suspect that they would make a recommendation to your board, and the board would do the same thing, review, discuss. But ultimately, if your board decides, yeah, we're gonna go for it, we're gonna take a position on this particular issue. Let's say it's a local zoning issue. It's obviously important that your board and that you as the leader then communicates that position to the appropriate elected or appointed state policy leader or leaders. But obviously you also want to communicate your position to your members so they're aware of what you're up to, and the media, so that you get some earned media as a result of it. I don't think, this is, taking positions on public policy issues is not for the faint of heart. So, you may end up taking a position or positions that not all of your members are going to support. There is rarely, if ever, unanimity on the positions that the BIA takes. But because we, in our case, weigh in on dozens and dozens of legislation and regulations every year, in the main, the positions that we take are where most thoughtful business leaders come down on public policy issues. And I would argue that the same thing is true in your own backyards. That if you take positions, not everybody's going to support you, but if you're out there and active, they will respect you if you do this in a respectful way. And it's going to help, and I absolutely believe it will help you with retention and with new member attraction. And just one final note, and that is that the positions that we take and the way we communicate them, we being the BIA, are always respectful and professional and nonpartisan. Again, we don't care what political party, elected or appointed policy leader holds. We just care about their position on issues. And so we never, in our communicating our position and our responding to questions, we never use inflammatory language. We never use emotional language. I mean, I think that's what's wrong, largely what's wrong with what's happening at the federal level. You have these elected policy leaders, and in many cases, their followers that are calling the other side idiots or, nincompoops or whatever. There's no need for that kind of a language. It's just those that are receiving that kind of emotional language react as anybody would in not a thoughtful way. They will react emotionally. So we do our very, very best at the BI to be respectful, professional, and nonpartisan with the positions and the communications that we have with elected and appointed state policy leaders. So again, just to recap, I've been there. I've done what I'm suggesting that those of you that don't have a government affairs or public policy committee, I've formed one myself at a Chamber of Commerce in upstate New York. And it was a good move. It was a tremendous value add, and we get a lot of support. Again, not everybody agreed with positions that we took, but they understood why we did it. And it was helpful to us and sort of put us on the map in a significant way. So Wendy, I'll stop there. I'm happy to try and answer any questions.
Does anyone have any questions for Jim about how chambers can advocate before we move on to our Capital Connect portion?
Wendy, just real quickly, Jim, a lot of our small chambers, and maybe this will tie right into Capital Connect, but we don't have a full-time position dedicated to watching legislation. So the BIA is very helpful for the chamber. You guys do a great job with your summaries and things. But mostly our chamber for many years was very hesitant to take positions because they figured they'd alienate half the demographic. And the bottom line is that they joined for representation on the business community. So it's not going to be as divisive as you think when you take a position on something that is relative to helping the business community. That's the purpose of the nonprofit. But what the other thing that our Government Affairs Committee does is if you want to start one, you can start easy with organizing. We do all the candidates nights in town, nonpartisan. We get both sides, and we do all the Washington update. Back when we could gather, we'll have like the state senators in, brought to you by the Chamber of Commerce, to have them address business issues. So it's even the chambers, it's kind of the way to get into taking a position, because you come in and you give your members their voice, direct access to the officials. So we do a lot of hosting, and one of my members is on here. Thanks, Dan, of the committee. But yeah, I just wanted to add that you start with the hosting of events and the access so that they can say their issues directly to their representative.
Yeah, it's great. It's a great thought. Yeah, absolutely.
It's also important to send out to your members the opportunity to serve on committees. We do that typically at the beginning of every year. And that way, if you get some blowback from a particular member that they weren't happy with a position you took, you can say you're welcome to always join us. I found that if we have somebody who doesn't agree with us, then they can join us, then they do have a voice. Any other questions for Jim on advocacy?
Well, another thing too is, Jim, as far as when you set that up at the chamber, the position has to come from the board. So that committee that you form, then I'm assuming makes a recommendation to the board, because the committee does the legwork on getting informed and then informs the board, and then the board takes the position. It's not right. Is that if you're trying to help people set up these committees? Flow.
I think so. I mean, I think it would be a very rare situation indeed where a government affairs committee, essentially a subcommittee of the board, would speak on behalf of the entire organization. So I think, the board controls policy. So I would argue that probably 99% of the time, the position that a government affairs committee recommends or takes would need to be approved by the board of directors. Otherwise, you're going to be out on that plank, and they're going to be sawing it off. Your board is going to be sawing it off behind you, if not running it by them.
Yeah, I just wanted that out there for like the 101, setting up your government affairs committee. Everything has the board's blessing.
Your comment about I had a small chamber. I ran the government affairs committee. I mean, I was the staff person, and I did it because we were losing members, and I needed to do something to show value. And given that chambers of commerce were established to represent the business community, seemed like a natural. And I thought, okay, we're going to do this. And if we lose some nonprofit members, so be it. But, the world goes around because of private sector activity where, private businesses generate the tax revenue that government relies on, and that nonprofits like the BIA rely on. Successful private enterprise makes the world go round. It doesn't, it's not the reverse, not the public sector that drives the economy. It's the private sector.
Jim, Valerie had a question. she wants to know, who would you recommend should be on your policy committee for our chambers?
Business leaders. Business leaders. You know, I don't think a government affairs committee should be led by a charitable nonprofit leader. I think that folks from the charitable nonprofit community see the world a little bit differently than folks from the for-profit community. And so I would argue that the government affairs committee should be largely comprised of private sector business leaders, and certainly should be led by somebody from the private sector. And it should not have folks from the public sector on the committee. Again, they're your target. At the end of the day, those are the folks that you're trying to convince to do something or not do something. And if you have them on your committee, they're helping you shape policy that they'll be the recipient of. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Thank you. Do you want to go ahead and segue into the Capital Connect program? Sure.
Yeah. So in 2008, so actually, you know, in our business, I think plagiarism is the highest form of flattery. And I think one of the reasons that the New Hampshire Association of Chamber of Commerce Executives exists, and probably one of its greatest values to members, which are chamber executives, is that we learn from one another, and ideas that we have and programs and opportunities that we have, we share, and we replicate that for our own chambers of commerce. So the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, I frankly don't even know if they still have this, but when I first started here at the BIA in 2005, they had a thing called Federation Membership, where if you were a member, if a group like the BIA was a member of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, they would extend a free electronic membership in the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to my members, BIA members, doing 10 million in revenue or less. So, so they sort of broadened their reach by bringing more small businesses into the U.S. Chamber fold. And I remember thinking, wow, that's kind of a cool thing. I wonder if we could do that at the state level. So in 2008, I met with about a dozen Chamber of Commerce executives here in New Hampshire. And I said, I want to do this, but I want to make sure it works for everybody, because I want to expand the BIA's voice through small businesses. But I want it to work for you too. So what we came up with is the Capital Connect membership program. And what it means is that in our case, the BIA extends a free electronic membership in the BIA. So participants in our Capital Connect membership program get all of the communications that my members get. They're just branded BIA Capital Connect. And it only goes, these communications, this membership only goes to members of local chambers of commerce in New Hampshire who are members of the BIA. So the local chamber has to be a member of the BIA, and then they have to choose to participate in the Capital Connect membership program. And if they do, your members, you know, for example, this Greater Salem Chamber of Commerce is a member of the BIA Capital Connect membership program. So Donna Morris's members employing 10 people or less. So we didn't use revenue the way U.S. Chamber did. We used head count. Donna Morris's members who employ 10 or fewer employees are automatically members of BI's Capital Connect membership program at no cost to Donna and no cost to her members. And you know, they remain essentially affiliate members of the BIA as long as they remain members of their local Chamber of Commerce. And what I argued then and what I would argue right now is that the benefit for a local Chamber of Commerce that participates in this is that your small businesses have more direct access to the deliberations of the New Hampshire legislature, the governor, and state agencies through the BIA, because that's what we do for a living, right? We monitor all of that stuff, and we weigh in on behalf of our members, and we communicate with our members. We're putting communications out all the time. So one key advantage for a local Chamber of Commerce that participates in this is that their own members get more direct communications and access to what's happening at the state level that affects their operations and their bottom line. It adds to the Chamber's value proposition, right? Because you're out there, as we are, trying to hang on to our existing members, right? So retention, and we're also always prospecting for new members. Well, if you can go to if a local chamber leader can go to a member or member prospect and say, well, hey, not only do you get a membership in the Greater Salem Chamber of Commerce and you have access to all the great benefits that we're providing, networking, advocacy, et cetera, but you also get a free electronic membership in the BIA. So essentially you get a twofer. Join the Greater Salem Chamber of Commerce, you get the stuff that we're doing, plus you get a membership in the BIA. So another reason for being active in the Capital Connect membership program. And then thirdly, it just raises the voice of business in New Hampshire at the State House and with appointed state policy leaders, department heads, because in my 16 years now at the BIA, I can count maybe on one hand the number of times that smaller businesses were at odds with larger businesses on a public policy issue affecting their operations. It is very rare. So by creating a larger group of business leaders throughout the state through Capital Connect, we raise the voice of the business community in our activities at the State House. So again, the benefit for local chambers that participate in the Capital Connect program are you afford your members, small business members, more direct access to the deliberations of the state, the public policy stuff through the BIA. You are able to pitch a two for it, becomes a very strong value add. You join my local chamber of commerce, and you get all our very strong benefits, but you also get a membership in the BIA, an electronic membership. And finally, you raise the voice of the business community throughout the state. What the BIA gets is obviously we want it to be a win-win. So 2 to 4 times a legislative session, there's an issue that we think is so important that we want to throw the net out as far as we can. So BIA itself has 400 members throughout the state. They tend to be leading employers in their communities. We go about 4 or 5 people deep per member. So we have roughly 1,400 individuals in our database representing our 400 members. So when we put out a call to action, so to speak, to our members, we're reaching out to about 1,400 business leaders around the state. But because we have these Capital Connect program relationships in place with 18 local chambers of commerce, we can expand that reach by an additional roughly 2,000 small businesses around the state. Again, 10 employees or less. So in totality, we're communicating when we put a call to action out to about 3,500 business leaders around the state. And we're in the call to action says, hey, on Thursday, the New Hampshire House is going to vote on this bill. Here's the number. Here's what it does. We don't think it's good for business. Click here and you can send a communication to the entire legislature or to members of the House in your area or whatever. We provide the content and we have the technology to allow both our members and Capital Connect members to kind of click through and generate an email on a specific topic with prepared language. And do legislators read all of the communications they get? No. Are they aware though when business leaders are inundating their email box on a particular issue? Absolutely. We know this because the legislators tell us about it. They say, wow, you guys must have activated your system because I'm getting all kinds of emails on this issue, on this, with this position. So that's the benefit to the BIA. We don't pursue small businesses. We don't want to be in competition with local chambers. The majority of your members, I think, are very small businesses. We just don't want to go there, but we want to include them in our advocacy efforts as much as we can. And so that was sort of the quid pro quo. We'll help you keep and attract new members through this Capital Connect membership program, but 2 to 4 times a year, we're going to put out a call to action to our entire database, including your small business members that you shared with us, and say, hey, please weigh in on this stuff. In terms of and I'll finish with, in terms of what the local business that is a member of a local chamber, that is a member of the Capital Connect membership program, what they get in addition to the occasional call to action is we put out a publication every Wednesday called eBrief to all of our members, and it also goes to Capital Connect members. Again, it's just a branded Capital Connect eBrief. And that's where we put positions we're taking in upcoming issues. That's where we'll put links to upcoming events, hosting Senator Shaheen or whatnot. So the Capital Connect members get the same content our members get every week. It's just branded as Capital Connect. And then during the legislative session, we have another publication, electronic publication called Legislative Review, which tracks all bills, all legislation that affects the business community by category, and then tracks their progress throughout the legislative session. So Capital Connect members get that publication as well. So I mentioned earlier that, through this relationship, your members have a more direct link to what's happening at the State House from the business community's perspective. So, and then finally, to the extent that your members want to, for example, today we have an event called Meet Legislative Leaders, where we've got the Majority Leader, Jeb Bradley, Senate Majority Leader, Democratic Leader, Donna Soucy in the Senate, Speaker Packard, and Democratic Leader, Rennie Cushing. We're doing an event at 4 called Meet the Legislative Leaders. And so this is probably a bad idea because we're not charging for it, but in the days when we had people meeting, in one place, we would charge, and Capital Connect members get the same pricing for all of our stuff that our own members get. So, for example, we have an annual energy conference, an annual environmental compliance conference. If your local business is a member of the Capital Connect program and they decide they want to check out the latest on energy policy throughout New Hampshire or the region, they can access that at BI member pricing. So again, it was created to create a win-win and a value add for both sides, the chamber side and the BIA side. And it's really, I'm not a lawyer, I drafted the agreement, and it basically, look, we're gonna do this in the spirit of cooperation. If you wanna back out at any time, go for it. If we decide we're gonna close the program down, we're gonna close it down. But it's been very successful. So, and as I said earlier, if your chamber is not now engaged or aware of what's happening at the State House, I would argue that you ought to be, even if only participating in the deliberations through the BIA. But so I'll stop there, Donna. Wendy.
That's okay. I get called all sorts of names. That's fine. I'll answer to anything. Jim, part of the reason I asked you to go over this added benefits, the advocacy, obviously, and the Capital Connect was not only for information for new chamber execs, but for those of us who may need a refresher. So I'm one of the ones that needs the refresher. How do we make sure that our members who have less than 10 employees are signed up for Capital Connect?
Well, the way it works is that it's an opt-out. So so if a chamber decides to enter into this relationship, you sign what we call a Capital Connect partnership agreement. And typically this would be debated or discussed or whatnot at the board level. And the board would say, yeah, that's a good idea, let's do it. And if that's the case, then you share with us your database of members, 10 employees or less. And part of the commitment is that we will in no way, shape, or form pursue your small businesses as members of the BI. We don't want to go there. We don't, it's not worth my time to go after a 10-person operation. It just isn't. I want to go after a 100-person operation because, for obvious reasons. So we absolutely don't recruit or pursue small businesses. So that's sort of the quid pro quo. You share your database of your members employing 10 or fewer, and then we load them in. And lately, we don't even care about the name of the company or the individual. We just need the email addresses. So in terms of, any kind of concern about BIA, prospecting your own members, it just doesn't happen. And so we load that in. And so then when we do put out a legislative alert to the business community, we now have these databases of members from chambers throughout the state. The intent is to update that, to encourage chambers to update their database that they're sharing with us, again, of these small business members regularly. But, the reality is that we don't have the horsepower to stay on top of it as much as we'd like. So this is all a voluntary cooperative relationship that I think benefits both sides.
Is there a contact at the BIA for chamber execs who want to either update our membership lists? For example, if we got 5 new members this week, obviously we would, and they were all with 10 or less employees, we would want the BIA to have that so that they could start inviting our members to be Capital Connect members. So is there a particular person that we would reach out to at the BIA?
I would say for right now, just me. We had somebody attached to this specific responsibility, but when COVID-19 hit, we downsized a little bit. So at this point, it's me.
Okay, good to know. We're coming up on 11:25. I would open up to questions for any of our panelists today. Either raise your hand. Liz, I'm gonna have you call on them since I can't see them, or just go ahead and fire away. Any questions? No questions from chamber people? I'm shocked. All right, I will end with this then.
I will ask one if I could.
Okay, Rite, go ahead.
Hey, Jim, you had mentioned in there, I think if I understood you correctly, you mentioned that the chambers had to sign on to participate with the Capital Connect program. Is that correct? Or is it just our membership automatically makes us eligible?
No, you have to, proactively sign on to become a Capital Connect partner. And part of the agreement is that you're going to share your database with us. So we don't do opt-in. You have to share the database and then communicate with your members. And if they want to opt out, they can do that. But that's the deal. You have to be a member. The chamber has to be a member of the BIA. And honestly, I'm not sharing all this to recruit new chamber members. We're not going to live or die on how many local chambers we have as members. But I do think this is a wonderful win-win for both sides. So you got to be a member of the BIA, and then you have typically run the idea of the Capital Connect by your board. And if they sign off, then you share your database of 10 employees or less with us. And as I said, we'll just take email addresses. We don't need anything more than that. And so then your small business members start getting our communications, labeled or branded Capital Connect. And then on those rare occasions, sort of 2 or 3 times each legislative session, when we put out a legislative alert, it's going to go to your small business members.
All right, thank you, Jim, and thank you, panelists. I did want to mention to our
I know about the other half, so I'll follow up with you.
Well, Wendy, there is one question I do want to address, if I can, real quickly. I understand the point of view not to have a committee led by nonprofit charities, but I assume you don't think that these organizations should be excluded from participation on these committees, bearing in mind that nonprofits really are businesses as well. And my response is, yeah, no, I think it's fine to have nonprofit leaders participate on the Government Affairs Committee, but recognize that in many cases, nonprofits, especially charitable nonprofits, are relying on government grants, on relationships with elected officials. And so I just hearken back to the reason chambers were created. It's the private, and I mean, I'm an independent politically, and I'm not an economist, but I would argue that it's the private sector that makes our economy go. It's not the reverse. It's not the public sector. The public sector is there to create laws and rules about how all this works, but it's not the public sector that makes the world go round or makes the economy grow. It's the private sector. So we as chambers were created to represent the private sector. And so I think we just need to be mindful of that in forming a government affairs or public affairs committee. Absolutely, nonprofit leaders should participate. We have them participate at the BIA, but in terms of driving policy, it's the private sector that drives our policy.
And Mike is actually on my government action committee, which is what we call our advocacy committee. I think we will wrap it up. It's around 11:30. Thank you all for joining us for New Hampshire Association of Chamber of Commerce Executives first webinar of the year. If you have topics that are of interest to you, please let me know. Special thanks to Brad Cook, to Dave and Dave, and to Jim Roach for making this happen.
Thank you, Wendy. Thanks, everybody. We appreciate your attention.
Have a great day, everyone. Stay well.